It's every homeowner's nightmare, a small, everyday issue escalating into something far more dangerous than you ever imagined. You're just minding your own business, trying to live your life, but the neighborhood HOA self-appointed enforcer has a problem with the way you do things. What begins as a simple dispute over a parking spot quickly spirals out of control when Karen, the HOA Karen, pulls out a gun. Yes, you read that right, a gun. This isn't the kind of situation you'd expect when you buy a house in a quiet neighborhood, but I quickly learned that when you cross paths with a Karen determined to assert her authority, anything can happen. This is the story of how a dispute over a parking spot became the most intense, unexpected, and downright terrifying experience of my life. The first few months in my new home were peaceful. I had finally found a place of my own in a quiet neighborhood, and for the most part, things seemed perfect. My house was a decent size, there was plenty of space for my car, and the neighbors were friendly, or so I thought. Then came Karen. Karen lived 2 doors down from me. I had heard rumors about her even before I officially met her. People said she was a stickler for rules, always making sure that everyone in the neighborhood followed the HOA guidelines to the letter. While I respected that a well-maintained community is important, I never imagined I would come to dread the thought of seeing her walking down the street with her clipboard in hand. It all started one weekend when I had invited some friends over for a small get-together at my house. As usual, everyone parked along the street, and there was a spot available right in front of my house. I parked my car there, thinking nothing of it. After all, there were plenty of spots available on the street, and I'd always parked there without issue. But as the night went on, the friendly gathering quickly turned into something I never expected. I was inside my house, chatting with my friends, when I heard a loud knocking on the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I went to answer it. And standing there on the porch, clipboard in hand, was Karen. She didn't even greet me. She immediately launched into her usual spiel. "You're blocking my driveway, and this is a violation of HOA rules," she said, barely giving me a chance to speak. I was taken aback. "I'm not blocking your driveway. There's plenty of room for you to get out," I replied, trying to stay calm. Karen's eyes narrowed. "It's still against the rules. You shouldn't be parking here, and I'm reporting you to the HOA." I was confused. I had parked in the same spot for weeks, without any issues. "Karen, this is a public street, and there's no sign saying I can't park here. I'm not blocking anyone's driveway," I insisted, a little more firmly this time. But Karen wasn't having any of it. "I'm telling you now. You need to move your car immediately," she said, her voice growing louder and more demanding. "I'm tired of people like you coming into this neighborhood and breaking the rules." I wasn't going to let her bully me. "I'm not moving my car, Karen. This is ridiculous," I said, standing my ground. At this point, Karen's demeanor shifted. Her face reddened, and her lips tightened into a thin line. "You don't want to make me angry," she hissed, raising her voice. "You think you can just break the rules and get away with it?" Before I could respond, Karen stepped back from the door and turned toward her house. I assumed she was just going to leave, but then she turned around suddenly and shouted, "You'd better move your car, or I'll take matters into my own hands." I froze, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "What do you mean, take matters into your own hands?" I asked, feeling a twinge of unease. Without saying another word, Karen reached into her purse, and to my horror, she pulled out a gun. My heart dropped into my stomach as she pointed it in my direction. "I told you," she said, her voice cold and steely. "Move your car, or I'll make you regret it." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't the neighborhood I had signed up for. This wasn't a petty argument over parking. It was a threatening situation, and I was in danger. For a moment, I was paralyzed, my mind racing to understand what had just happened. My first instinct was to retreat into the house and lock the door, but I realized that Karen was standing too close, and I couldn't let her get away with threatening me. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" I managed to say, my voice shaky but firm. She didn't answer. Instead, she continued to stand there, holding the gun at her side, her finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. "I'm not going to ask again," she said, her eyes glaring at me. "Move your car." In that moment, I knew I had to de-escalate the situation. There was no way I was going to get into a standoff with her over a parking spot. I needed to get her to leave, without making the situation worse. I took a slow, cautious step back, trying not to provoke her. Okay, I said, my voice steady but cautious. I'll move the car, but you need to leave now. This is insane. Karen didn't lower the gun. She just gave me one last, venomous look before turning around and walking back to her house. I stood there, still in shock, as I watched her disappear into the door, gun still in hand. The moment she was out of sight, I quickly rushed back inside, locked the door, and took a few deep breaths to calm myself. I couldn't believe what had just happened. A simple parking dispute had escalated into a life-threatening situation. I immediately called the police, explaining the entire situation and the fact that Karen had threatened me with a firearm. They assured me they would investigate the matter. While waiting for the police to arrive, I couldn't help but replay the whole encounter in my mind. How had things gotten so out of control? A parking spot. That was all it took to set her off. And I knew from that moment on that Karen wouldn't stop there. If she could escalate a parking dispute into a violent threat, she would have no hesitation doing the same to anyone else. When the police arrived, I was still in shock. I told them exactly what had happened, recounting the entire incident from the moment Karen knocked on my door to when she pulled out the gun. I could see the disbelief on the officers' faces as they listened. They took the situation seriously, though, and immediately began to assess the severity of the threat. They told me to stay inside while they went to speak to Karen and investigate the matter further. As I waited, my mind raced with thoughts of what had just transpired. I had never expected something as simple as a parking spot dispute to turn into a life-threatening confrontation. I had only moved into this neighborhood recently, hoping for a quiet, peaceful life, but now it seemed like I was stuck in some twisted version of a real-life horror story. All of this because of one woman, Karen, the self-appointed HOA enforcer. I couldn't stop wondering if this was just the beginning. If she was willing to threaten me with a gun, what would she do next? And who else might be the next target of her irrational rage? I couldn't help but wonder about her history. Was this the first time Karen had done something like this? Or was this just the latest in a series of increasingly erratic behaviors? What kind of person would pull a gun over something as trivial as parking? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I knew about Karen and the other people in the neighborhood. The HOA had always been a quiet presence, but now I started to see it in a different light. If one person could escalate something as minor as a parking spot dispute to such an extreme, what else could happen if other members of the HOA felt the same way? An hour later, the police came back to my door, their faces grim. They told me that Karen had denied everything. Of course, she claimed I was lying, that I had somehow provoked her, and that she had never pulled a gun on me. The officers told me that, without solid evidence, like a witness or surveillance footage, it would be difficult to charge her with anything criminal. But I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't about to let this go. I made it clear to the officers that I wanted to file a formal complaint. They told me they would write up a report, but they couldn't promise anything more at this stage. It was a frustrating realization, but I wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about me anymore. I had to make sure Karen didn't get away with threatening others in the neighborhood. The next day, I decided to take action. I reached out to a lawyer, explained the situation, and asked if there was anything that could be done to hold Karen accountable. The lawyer told me that, while it was difficult without hard evidence, I could still pursue a civil lawsuit. The lawyer also mentioned that, if Karen had a history of threatening behavior, this could be the push I needed to get a restraining order. That's when I realized something. If Karen was willing to escalate a simple issue to the point of violence, this wasn't just a one-time mistake. This could be the tip of the iceberg. I needed to stop this before it escalated even further, not just for my safety, but for the safety of everyone in the neighborhood. The next step was to gather as much information as I could. I talked to other neighbors, and sure enough, it turned out that Karen's behavior wasn't exactly new. Several of my neighbors had told me stories about how she had tried to push them around in the past, whether it was with parking violations, yard issues, or anything else she could find to complain about. It was clear that Karen had a habit of using her role as a self-appointed HOA enforcer to control others, and I was starting to think that her aggressive tendencies were much deeper than just a few complaints. One of my neighbors, Steve, even told me that Karen had been involved in a heated argument with another neighbor over a shed in the backyard, and that she had threatened to report them to the HOA and the city to get it torn down. Steve had witnessed the exchange and said he had heard Karen yelling at the neighbor, insisting that they tear down the structure. He even mentioned that Karen had made threats of escalating things further if the neighbor didn't comply. I felt the anger building in me. This wasn't just a random incident. This was part of a pattern of behavior that was becoming all too clear. Karen had been getting away with these bullying tactics for far too long, and I was done being the silent observer. The following week, I went to the HOA board meeting. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I had to stand up for myself and, more importantly, for the other residents who were too afraid to speak out. When I walked into the meeting, I could feel the tension in the air. I could already tell that people were nervous about speaking out against Karen. She was a fixture in the neighborhood, and most people were intimidated by her authority. I stood up and addressed the board. I'm here today because I feel it's time for the HOA to take responsibility for the actions of one of its members. I've been threatened with a weapon by Karen over something as trivial as a parking spot. And while I know this isn't the first time she's threatened someone, I can't let it slide anymore. The room went silent. I could see Karen sitting across from me, her face flushed with anger and disbelief, but she didn't speak up. The other board members looked uncomfortable, but I could tell they were paying attention. I continued. I've spoken to several other neighbors who have had similar encounters with Karen. She's gone too far, and we can't let her intimidate and control us anymore. After a long silence, one of the board members spoke up. We'll look into this matter, he said, his voice unsure. But we need to review the situation carefully. I wasn't satisfied with that response, but it was a start. I knew it was going to take time to make real change, but I was determined to keep pushing. I wasn't going to let Karen's behavior go unchecked. It was time for her to face the consequences of her actions, and I wasn't going to stop until I held her accountable. After that meeting, things didn't immediately change, but I could feel the pressure building. Karen's days of unchecked power were coming to an end, and I wasn't about to back down. I had started something, and I had no intention of stopping now. Every day that passed, I kept thinking about the neighborhood and the people who had suffered silently at the hands of Karen's tyranny. I could see how intimidated everyone was, how they put up with her rules and complaints because they were scared of what might happen if they spoke out. I began gathering more stories from the neighbors, collecting their testimonies and evidence of Karen's behavior. I spoke with Steve again, who recalled another instance when Karen had threatened to call animal control on his dog, even though it was completely unfounded. Steve had a big, friendly golden retriever, and Karen had called it a nuisance simply because it barked occasionally. I made sure to document everything, dates, events, and what was said. I also reached out to others, and soon I had a collection of accounts that painted a disturbing picture. With this evidence in hand, I decided to go public. I had had enough of the secrecy and fear. The HOA board wasn't taking enough action, and Karen was still out there, walking the neighborhood with her sense of entitlement. If they weren't going to act, I would force them to. It was time to turn the tables. One night, I sat down at my computer and drafted a letter. It was a simple message to the other homeowners in the area, explaining what had happened to me, and outlining how Karen had crossed the line in her attempts to enforce HOA rules with threats of violence and intimidation. I included the accounts of others, giving them a voice in the fight against Karen. The letter was polite but firm, and I made sure it was clear. Karen needed to be held accountable, and the HOA had a responsibility to act in the interest of the community. The next day, I walked around the neighborhood, dropping off copies of the letter to every home. I made sure to introduce myself to some of the neighbors I hadn't spoken to before, letting them know I was the one who had written the letter. Some were hesitant, but many expressed their support. It was clear that I wasn't the only one who had been pushed too far. A week later, I received a message from Steve. He'd gotten word that the HOA had called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. This was it. The momentum was building. Karen couldn't hide behind the shield of the HOA any longer. The community was speaking out, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. I showed up at the meeting early, wanting to be there when it all unfolded. I was ready to present the evidence and make my case. I wasn't just going to back down this time. The other homeowners who had supported me were also there, some even bringing witness statements to reinforce the gravity of the situation. When Karen arrived, she seemed unfazed by the growing tension in the room. She walked in, clipboard in hand, and took her seat at the front. It was clear she wasn't expecting the kind of backlash she was about to face. As the meeting began, the board members called for reports from residents. One by one, people began to speak out about their experiences with Karen. Steve spoke about the incident with his dog. Another neighbor mentioned how Karen had tried to force them to remove their garden, and several others chimed in with complaints of Karen's overbearing behavior. The room was filled with anger, the kind of anger that had been quietly simmering for years. When my turn came, I stood up, feeling the weight of the moment. I addressed the board calmly but firmly, outlining my encounter with Karen and how it had escalated. I presented the documents and witness statements I had gathered, making sure to highlight the pattern of threatening behavior. I didn't just want to win this for myself. I wanted to make sure no one else had to face the same harassment. When I finished, the room fell silent. Karen looked visibly uncomfortable, her hands clutching her clipboard tightly. She was no longer the confident, self-assured enforcer she had once been. Now she was the accused, and the power had shifted. The board members began to speak, acknowledging the severity of the situation. They expressed concern over Karen's actions and how they had gone against the HOA's own principles of creating a supportive, respectful community. After a lengthy discussion, they made a decision. They would suspend Karen from her role as an HOA representative and launch a formal investigation into her actions. The meeting ended with a sense of triumph. The board had finally done the right thing, and Karen's reign of intimidation had come to an end. The rest of the neighborhood was relieved. Some even came up to thank me for speaking out. I could see the sense of empowerment in their eyes, knowing that they no longer had to live in fear of Karen's unwarranted authority. For me, this was just the beginning of a new chapter. I had taken a stand, not only for myself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been too afraid to speak up. Karen's grip on the HOA was over, but the impact of what had happened would last far beyond that single confrontation. The following weeks were a whirlwind. The HOA board began to take a more active role in ensuring that community disputes were handled fairly and with respect. Karen was no longer a fixture at HOA meetings, and the neighborhood felt more open and welcoming. No longer was I afraid of Karen's threats. She had lost her power. In the days following the meeting, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but there was an undeniable sense of relief in the air. Karen was no longer the intimidating figure she once was. She no longer held the same influence over the HOA, and for the first time in a long while, the community felt like it was finally able to breathe. As I went about my daily routine, I found myself enjoying the peacefulness more than I ever thought I would. I noticed that people in the neighborhood started to come together more. Neighbors were having casual conversations on the sidewalks and stopping to chat about things beyond their lawns and parking spaces. It was as though the veil of fear Karen had cast over us had been lifted, but not everyone shared in the collective relief. While most people kept their distance from Karen, there was still a palpable tension every time I saw her in the street. She wasn't openly confrontational anymore, but I could feel the animosity in the air whenever she was near. Her once confident and authoritative demeanor had been replaced with something closer to shame. But Karen wasn't the type of person to stay down for long, and I knew she'd find a way to claw her way back into the spotlight if given the chance. One evening, I was sitting on my front porch, enjoying a quiet moment when I saw her. Karen was walking down the street, and she didn't see me at first. She was alone, but I could tell by her stiff posture that she was still harboring that same grudge. As she neared my driveway, she stopped abruptly and looked straight at me. I braced myself for whatever she might say. Instead of the confrontation I had anticipated, Karen simply stared for a long moment, her lips pressed tightly together, and her eyes glinted with something that looked like resentment, but also a strange form of acknowledgement. For a second, I thought she might say something, but then she simply turned and walked away without a word. It was an odd interaction, but it left me with a sense of unfinished business. I had won the battle, but the war with Karen wasn't over. I knew she wasn't the type to simply accept defeat quietly. This encounter had reminded me that people like Karen don't easily let go of their need for control, and I wasn't naive enough to think that her silence was a sign of capitulation. Over the following days, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was laying low, waiting for the right moment to make her move. The HOA had put her on a temporary suspension, but there was no telling how long that would last. I was determined not to let my guard down. I knew the power dynamic in the neighborhood had shifted, but Karen had always been a persistent force, and I wasn't about to give her the opportunity to return to her old ways. One afternoon, I got a call from Steve, a neighbor who had been one of the first to back me up during the HOA meeting. He told me he had heard from several people that Karen had been going door to door, talking to residents about reclaiming the community and starting a new HOA. My initial reaction was disbelief. After everything that had happened, was she really trying to rally the neighborhood against us? I couldn't believe it, but as Steve explained, I could feel the wheels turning in my head. Karen wasn't just trying to keep control over her own turf. She was trying to rally support for her own agenda. This wasn't just about a parking space or her position on the board. It was about Karen trying to reassert her dominance in any way she could. As soon as I hung up with Steve, I began to gather my thoughts. I couldn't let her destabilize everything we had worked for. The whole reason I had confronted her in the first place was to make sure that people didn't have to live in fear of someone who thought they had the right to control others' lives. I wasn't going to let Karen continue to spread her toxic influence. I needed to act fast. I decided to reach out to the neighbors who had supported me during the meeting. I called them one by one, including Steve, and shared what I had learned. It became clear that Karen's campaign wasn't just a small, isolated effort. She was actively trying to recruit members for a new version of the HOA, one where she could call the shots once again. But we weren't going to let that happen. Together, we brainstormed a plan. We couldn't allow Karen to undo all the progress we had made. The next step was simple. We had to stand united. We would hold a meeting of our own, inviting everyone in the neighborhood, to show that the community wasn't going to stand for Karen's self-serving tactics anymore. I set up a meeting for the following Saturday and made sure to spread the word quickly. I emphasized that this wasn't about fighting against Karen. It was about ensuring that we could have a neighborhood that supported fairness, respect, and transparency, and that Karen's actions had violated those values. I wanted to make sure that everyone felt empowered to speak up, and more importantly, that they felt supported in doing so. Saturday came quickly, and the turnout was incredible. The room was packed with residents eager to take action and protect their homes. We discussed the issues at hand, Karen's tactics, her threats, and how she had used her position in the HOA for her own gain. But the focus quickly shifted to how we could move forward as a united community. One by one, people spoke up about their experiences with Karen. Some shared how they had been bullied into following unreasonable demands, while others shared how they had been afraid to speak out for fear of retaliation. As each person shared their story, it became clearer that Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a bully, and she had been using her position to intimidate and control everyone around her. The more we talked, the more united we became. In the end, the group made a decision. We would write a formal petition to the HOA, requesting that Karen be permanently removed from any role of authority in the neighborhood. But it wasn't just about Karen anymore. We also discussed establishing a more open and transparent HOA, one that truly represented the people, not a few self-appointed enforcers who thought they could run the neighborhood with an iron fist. After the meeting, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't expected. The group had come together, not out of anger, but out of a shared desire to protect our community from further harm. We knew we had to stand together, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had felt oppressed by Karen's behavior. With our plan in place, we began collecting signatures for the petition. The ball was rolling, and Karen's days of domination in the neighborhood were numbered. We weren't just fighting for a parking spot anymore. We were fighting for the soul of our community. We spent the next few days collecting signatures for the petition, and the response from the neighborhood was overwhelmingly positive. People who had once stayed silent out of fear or indifference now found their voices. It was clear that Karen's behavior had caused a deep undercurrent of frustration in the community, and they were ready for change. Even some of the people who had been too intimidated to attend the meeting showed up, eager to lend their support. As we made our rounds, we could see that the tide was turning. The more signatures we gathered, the more it became apparent that Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. People were tired of living in fear of her unpredictable and overbearing demands. And as more residents signed a petition, it became a symbol of unity, an emblem of the collective desire to restore balance to the community. I began to feel a renewed sense of hope. Maybe this wasn't just about stopping one woman from getting her way. Maybe this was the beginning of something bigger, something that would shape the neighborhood for years to come. By the end of the week, we had gathered over 50 signatures, more than enough to present the petition to the HOA board. I knew that presenting it in front of the board would be the next challenge, but I was confident that we had the support we needed. The community had spoken, and it was time for the HOA to listen. We scheduled the meeting, and with our petition in hand, we prepared for what would be a pivotal moment. The day of the meeting arrived, and the anticipation was palpable. I had invited several neighbors to attend, those who had been vocal in their support, and I could see the sense of determination in their eyes. This wasn't just about a single issue. It was about claiming back control over our neighborhood and showing that no one, not even Karen, could dictate the terms of our lives with threats and intimidation. When we walked into the HOA meeting room, it was like walking into a different world. The air was thick with tension, but there was a noticeable difference. Instead of walking in with heads down, trying to avoid Karen's glare, everyone stood tall, shoulders squared, ready to speak up. We weren't the intimidated residents anymore. We had become a united front. As the meeting began, I could feel Karen's eyes on me. She was sitting at the front, her usual confident demeanor replaced by an air of defensiveness. She wasn't the same self-assured woman who had once commanded the neighborhood with her rules. She was a cornered animal now, and I could tell she knew it. One by one, we stood to present our case. I spoke first, explaining how Karen's actions had not only threatened my safety, but had created an environment of fear and discomfort in the neighborhood. I spoke about how her control over the HOA had made it impossible for many of us to feel comfortable in our own homes. When I finished, the room was silent, and I could feel everyone's attention on Karen, waiting for her response. To my surprise, Karen didn't try to argue back. Instead, she sat there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of anger and resentment. She didn't speak a word as the other neighbors shared their experiences. The pattern was clear. Karen's behavior was erratic, and it was becoming increasingly obvious that she had no place in a community that valued respect and cooperation. By the time the meeting ended, the board had made their decision. They agreed to remove Karen from her position as the HOA enforcer, effectively ending her reign of intimidation. As the news spread, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This wasn't just my victory. It was the victory of everyone who had stood up to Karen, who had decided to no longer tolerate her abuse. But as I left the meeting that day, a small part of me felt a little unsure. Yes, we had won, but Karen hadn't simply disappeared from the neighborhood. She still lived just 2 doors down, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy to get back to normal. Karen wasn't the type to quietly accept defeat. Her pride had been wounded, and I could tell she would be looking for ways to reassert her control. A few days later, I saw her again, walking down the sidewalk as I pulled out of my driveway. This time, she didn't even look at me. She was silent, almost as if she was trying to pretend like nothing had happened. But I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't done. Karen wasn't going to fade away quietly. Still, I couldn't let that bother me. We had stood up to her, and we had won. The neighborhood had shown that they weren't going to let anyone, no matter how powerful they thought they were, tear it apart. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like the community was on the right path again. We had created a space where people could feel safe, where they could live without fear of someone using their position to bully others into submission. But as time went on, I knew that our work wasn't finished. I still had to be vigilant. Karen might have been removed from her HOA position, but she was still Karen, still a force to be reckoned with, still the type of person who would always try to find another way to control. I made it my mission to stay involved, to keep the lines of communication open between my neighbors, and to always be ready for whatever Karen might throw at us next. I wasn't about to let her ever take away the peace we had fought for. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more about how we dealt with Karen and other neighborhood drama, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more updates. Your support means a lot, and we've got plenty of other stories to share. Let me know in the comments if you've had a similar experience or if you think Karen will ever really give up. Thanks for watching, and remember, always stand your ground when it counts.